In recent years, views on climate change has taken an unsettling turn. The debate on actions we can take has taken a backseat to the juggernaut of financial crises and political uncertainty that rolled through recent times.
Despite many world players dragging their heels on reducing emissions, Europe has committed to making big cuts. Ireland is obliged to play its part, and we have some very tough emission targets to face. The problem in the past is that our CO2 emissions have always tracked economic growth. Now we need to plan for a future where we can create economic wealth at the same time as reducing greenhouse gas emissions. But what does this mean for all of us at home, already struggling to deal with day-to-day life? We've seen tremendous efforts from sustainable community groups all over the country, frustrated with the lack of action, now trying to sow the seeds of change. While over a quarter of Irish households have increasing issues of fuel poverty, struggling to heat their homes. So what are the big issues and decisions that we will need to make to achieve climate change targets and at the same time reduce our dependence on rising costs of imported fuels? In today's programme, we'll be looking at what impact our climate change targets could have on our daily lives. Despite past confusion and misconceptions about some of the detail of climate science, the facts are often misunderstood. However, the fundamental science of climate change has never been in dispute. Our fossil fuels were formed from prehistoric plants and animals that lived hundreds of millions of years ago. During past millennia, the plants and animals absorbed high levels of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. These organisms slowly decomposed and stored layers of carbon to form fossil fuels, buried under sand, earth and rock. This gave us the abundant oxygen in the air we breathe and the life-sustaining climate we have today. When we burn fossil fuels, we release carbon dioxide, trapping more heat in our atmosphere, where it is now warming up the planet at an unprecedented rate. Over many natural climate cycles and ice ages, massive sheets of ice have formed on land. These ice sheets are so large that if Greenland's ice cap melted, it would alone raise world sea levels by an incredible 7 metres. If we continue to warm the planet at this rate, we'll see more extreme weather events, expanded deserts, as well as accelerated melting of ice sheets, which would mean a more rapid rise in sea level, threatening the world's coastal cities this century.
During the boom years, our emissions rocketed as our growth was fueled by energy from these ancient carbon sources.
As oil prices rise and climate change needs to be tackled globally, Europe has made the decision to make real cuts in emissions.
Ireland has now signed up to dramatically reduce emissions by at least 20% within the next 9 years, and by 2050 to be emitting practically nothing at all.
I asked Dr. Ken Mackin from the EPA to explain where that leaves us.
Even with the current measures we have in place, even if they deliver fully as anticipated, it looks like we are going to be exceeding those targets increasingly from year to year.
It also appears that the biting recession that has taken the heart out of our businesses has also temporarily slowed our emissions.
Good news from the climate point of view, but obviously bad news because it's mainly been caused by the economic recession. As a country, we are looking to a time when our economy begins to boom again. Our emissions will start to go back up. What we need to do is to build in reductions and in reduction strategies that will kick in advance of our economy moving back up again.
So it seems being broke buys us some time. But time is the real enemy here. As deadlines get nearer, the penalties for not meeting our targets rise, and at some point they become just too costly.
Even if we were able to buy our way out of it by using various mechanisms that are allowed, for a start it would be expensive, and secondly, there may not even be enough flexibility in those mechanisms to deal with that magnitude of exceedance.
Agriculture remains the single largest contributor to Ireland's greenhouse gas emissions at nearly 30% of the total, followed by power generation and transport, both at over 20% each. Dr. Brian O'Gallagher has fed our targets into a computer model he has devised at UCC in Cork to find out what are the most cost-effective and easiest options for meeting these tough targets.
Given that we've had this growth period, this 50% growth, effectively that means, looking at the energy side of things, that we need to have a 90% emissions reduction by 2050 relative to where we are now. And this is a huge change. You know, it's very radical.
It's down to 10% of all of our emissions from what we now have.
Exactly, yeah. You know, we see these targets in terms of 80% emissions reduction, but when you think of it in those terms, effectively it's 10% of what we generate now is our maximum in 2050. The challenge is huge.
So we've targets we can't avoid against a clock that seems to speed up the longer we leave it.
So what we need to do is to put in place additional measures to enable us to meet those targets. But the measures we put in place need to be well thought out. We're covering sectors such as transport, agriculture, domestic.
Even if we didn't have to deal with climate change, diminishing reserves and increased demand of oil is going to drive up the price we pay for energy. Decarbonising our economy is something we want to do anyway if we're going to remain competitive and support economic recovery.
There are costs involved in decarbonising economies. Europe is moving into a lower carbon scenario for a number of reasons. Energy security is one of them. Energy costs are going to continue to rise. Countries that have moved into low carbon technologies are going to be better able to withstand that. So that's a winner.
There are costs in transforming from old systems to new smart technologies in their transition stage. The problem is we don't have a mechanism to stimulate this change. But we do have choices about what direction we take. Timing is important because the race is on to see who will lead the renewable energy field. We've the best natural resources in Europe, but are slow in bringing solutions to market.
Tackling climate change is big business, and it seems we're in the middle of a race to try to make some money out of the big changes coming down the road. When we think of the $6 billion we spend each year on imports of oil, gas and coal, we can begin to imagine the amount of money we could save and the jobs we could generate if we only produce this energy here at home.
To get us out of this cycle, we need a new mechanism to change the trends by reducing fuel imports and using this money to create sustainable jobs at home in the energy sector. Currently, we have a small carbon levy that adds 4 cents per litre on fuel oils. If this levy was ring-fenced and increased, it could fund solutions to critical areas like energy retrofits to the vast number of vulnerable homes suffering from fuel poverty. It would also reduce our massive annual $6 billion loss in oil, coal and gas imports. And this money saved could fund green enterprises that would generate thousands of jobs around the country.
I don't know if carbon tax is a good idea. In theory, I guess it is, but I don't know. At the moment, we have enough increases in taxes to deal with.
I personally would be in favour of paying a higher carbon tax, but I don't think that the population in general would favour it.
It's fair enough if they're actually putting the money to good use.
I think if it replaces kind of a system whereby it's PAYE or whatever, I think it could be better. Like, we'll all work a little bit harder to reduce what we pay in taxes. But yeah, no, I think it's good. It's the way we have to go, you know.
Nobody wants another tax. The key is to find a mechanism that can reduce demand for these fuels while also making solutions affordable for people at home in difficult times.
Creates this 24-hour-a-day incentive. It generates revenue. The government can use this revenue to reduce other taxes. So, for example, business that's being challenged by a carbon tax, they can and should, where they're competing in international markets that people are not essentially paying the equivalent, they should benefit from reduction in other charges and taxes. So we have a kind of an opportunity, but it's difficult to realise because the incumbent business by definition is carbon-based. The new business that we have to get that isn't a lobby yet, of course, is the new low-carbon business. So politically it's a challenge, but most importantly, we have to create this atmosphere for the new wave of enterprise that can transform the economy.
To get people to buy into carbon taxes, we need to see other taxes coming down, and that's hard because all taxes seem to be going up. So the period of transformation will be hard to deliver, although it could be a route to new employment and new economic opportunities. In terms of our emissions, agriculture is our largest sector, but it's also a complex area because agriculture will need to expand to meet the demands of our international markets already planned for an economic booster in the Food Harvest 2020 programme. So what we need here is a smart approach.
It's one thing to cap the greenhouse gas emissions of Ireland as a whole, but what we have to keep into account is that our grass-based dairy systems that we have in Ireland are among the most efficient in the world. And that's not us saying that, it's the FAO published a report early this year where they compared all the dairy systems across the world, and the grass-based ones in the temperate regions have the lowest carbon footprint in the world. So we have to be careful when we say we want to reduce agriculture emissions by another 20 or 30%. There's a right way of doing it and there's a wrong way of doing it.
If we simply cap meat production, this may be replaced abroad in unregulated countries that are more carbon intensive. This pitfall is what's commonly called carbon leakage.
What we're looking at is reducing the emissions per litre of milk or per kilogram of beef. And other countries are doing the same, because what it does at this moment in time, it gives a marketing edge. Big supermarkets, big companies, multinationals these days are demanding a carbon footprint on the produce. And to get access to those big markets, we need to be able to show and prove that our systems have a low carbon footprint.
At UCC, Dr. Jerry Murphy is working on ways of providing farmers with alternative income streams that take the pressure off conventional farming. I met him down at his biogas research plant.
Jerry, what are the opportunities for farming to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions in Ireland?
Farming's very interesting. In 1900, farming was a major source of enterprise in Ireland. We would have got energy, materials, food. And then we've had the age of oil, where we're driving, we have oil making fertiliser, we've intensified agriculture. And oil has allowed the population rise from 1.5 billion in 1900 to about 7.5 billion at the moment. A viewpoint we would have is that oil is obviously in decrease. So we're going back to agriculture. We're looking at agriculture again, and we're going back to where we were, but we're trying to do it with better technologies. So we're looking at making liquid fuels or gaseous fuels from agriculture. And this offers a lot of potential.
Jerry's research project is to create gas from grass, effectively giving farmers the opportunity to turn their grass silage into energy. This helps them diversify from meat production and unlock another income stream. Research also shows switching from expensive nitrogen fertiliser to clover-rich swards could reduce emissions without affecting income. So we're developing a range of solutions that would work for agriculture. We now also have to work on incentives to make them attractive to farmers.
There's no silver magic bullet that will solve our problems. What we're looking at in Teagasc in our research programme is a mosaic of solutions, if you like. Many relatively small actions that together, when you add them up, will reduce our footprint per kilogram beef or per litre milk.
No clear win for climate change here. If we start to fall short of our targets, our other sectors come under increased pressure. Brian's climate model shows few solutions for our transport sector targets.
Transport is a hugely difficult sector to address because of our dispersed population and the need and the growth in demand for transportation that we've seen over the last number of years. So people are used to having their car and to driving it as they wish, and we need to effectively be weaned off oil.
Having become so dependent on our cars, we literally missed the bus when it came to creating a demand for the kind of public transport enjoyed in the rest of Europe.
As oil prices rise and head for €2 a litre, we're going to feel this emission where it hurts the most, in our pockets.
John Henry's time in the Dublin Transportation Office leaves him convinced we are leaving it late in the day to make the switch to more sustainable practices.
What we need to do is look at where we can actually do something better, like in the cities, in the urban areas. People can travel by public transport, walking, cycling. There are alternatives there. We're not exploiting that enough, because if we exploited that, it'll compensate for the legacy that we're carrying in relation to the long-distance commuters.
Public transport in Dublin is an absolute joke.
One of the things that would be great is if public transport maybe was a little bit more reliable, maybe more routes.
The rail links between the major cities are very expensive.
I think it's expensive and it's not coordinated.
People would drive less if there were a better integrated transport system.
So how do we make public transport in urban areas attractive like it is all over Europe?
Well, the key thing here is I think we've given the dominance to the car on our road network. We've got to change that attitude completely. We've got to get the bicycle, walking, public transport having the right of way effectively, so that people can travel reliably, because reliability is the key thing here. Get to where you want to go reliably in the time that you need to get it. And we have to put the car back a bit. Now, the car is needed for essential journeys, but we have to change our thinking.
So what can we do to change our approach to transport in the future?
Well, I think looking nationally, we've done superbly well in developing our road network, motorways all over the place. But what we've done with the railways now is we've made them less competitive, because now it's faster. You can get to Cork, Limerick, Galway faster than you can by train. Now, we need to redress that. I'm not saying that we go for high-speed trains, like the bullet train in Japan and that. I'm talking about just get the speed up a bit so that it becomes competitive with the car again. Because you'll have the reliability and the comfort on a train that you wouldn't have on the car. Another thing we could do is maybe utilise some of the spare capacity at night on the railways for freight movements. We haven't, I think, exploited that enough. And these are the sort of things that I think we need to start looking at, because obviously moving goods around the country is important for the economy.
Are our train prices too expensive? Intercity from Cork to Dublin, for example.
Well, I think that's something that will have to be looked at. But you see, travelling by car, we think it's cheap because you only put petrol in your car, diesel. But if you take the total cost of travel into account in terms of the cost to the environment and emissions and all of that, maybe it's not as expensive to travel by train. But it's something that I think we need to balance it out to make trains more competitive for long-distance travel.
So what do we do there? I mean, how are we going to get our emissions down, though? What's the mechanism that will drive down?
One of the things that I see from the transport point of view is we actually don't have really control of travel. And we have not controlling the demand for travel, and people feel that it's easy and cheap to travel, and therefore they continue to travel. It's not competitive. We need to kind of somehow or other balance it out, that the cost of travel is felt in your pocket, so that you make a choice of how you're going to travel. We don't make choices now. You just jump in your car, go down for a bottle of milk. That's not the way we have to do it in the future. We have to consciously decide what mode we're going to travel on when we're travelling.
Currently, the policies and integrated infrastructure that make public transport so attractive in the rest of Europe simply don't exist here. So taking cars out of the equation to reduce emissions will be very hard indeed. So if agriculture will find it difficult to meet its targets and transport stuck in the slow lane, is there another area that can pick up the slack? For anyone looking for a light at the end of the tunnel, it would seem a poor place to start. But that might not be so. Climate change targets mean we have to find energy savings in our building stock, and that means retrofitting most of what we've built. And that means jobs for an out-of-work construction sector.
To achieve the big reductions in the residential sector in heat and electricity power use requires a considerable investment. The payback now, especially if we're going to get another few winters like we've got, is huge, and it's essentially it pays for itself. The question is, though, can some people find the money to do it now? And for those people, we have to come up with a mechanism where essentially they can pay over time, where the savings that the investment makes are used to pay off the investment.
For practical purposes, if you insulate your home, you can use your heating for a much shorter period, and therefore you save it on fuel costs in the end.
No, I'm actually insulating my house at the moment using the government grant scheme because it's something I think is really important, just to cut down costs and just make your house just nicer to live in, really.
The other opportunity is that there are big economies of scale and scope in doing this. When you do it on a one-off house in one neighbourhood, it's much more expensive than if you did 300 houses in a state all at the same time. So we have to find ways to say to communities, look, really go for this big time. We'll help you. This is where the carbon tax can be critical because it creates an incentive for you to do it, first of all, because your energy is more expensive, and it also provides some revenue where you can essentially help make that transition. So a combination of the incentive, some subsidy, and community kind of regeneration, and all the jobs, of course, that go with that are a critical part as well. The innovation piece of it is also critical.
We need to find a way of retrofitting the homes of nearly 1 million people in the fuel poverty net that cannot afford heating. Upgrading our homes, investment in innovation and community regeneration are all things we would welcome as byproducts of reducing our emissions. But for our homeowners already strapped for cash, change comes with a price tag. I talked to Brian about the pay-as-you-save scheme.
Well, some of the new models that are coming out are quite interesting for this in terms of pay-as-you-save, where the suppliers of energy can effectively fund the investment up front and then stagger it over a number of years, adding it on to people's bills, so that while you're saving energy, you're paying the investment costs associated with that. So that will certainly help significantly. I think that kind of thinking is what we need more of.
Remember, we're locked in to very demanding targets for 2020 by the European Union. The cost of not doing that will be huge. So that's a nice kind of window. We have 10 years to say, okay, can we really combine innovation, combine enterprise, combine policy to really start the transformation process? And once we've got onto that kind of trajectory, of course, we're well positioned then to become global players for the next 10 to 20 years. So I think the global challenge is radical, and I think it would be nice if we can find niches in that particular challenge that allow us to transform ourselves in terms of an economy and a society, as well as making our contribution to the environment.
So we've reached a crossroads. Practically everything we do is powered by fossil fuels. They've become so much part of the very fabric of our life that we can't imagine a future without them. And yet, that's exactly what we have to do.
As oil becomes scarce, we'll have to reimagine a future for ourselves based on sustainable renewable energy. The path that takes us away from global warming embraces all these new technologies. It has to. There's no other way of cutting down greenhouse gases. It's fortunate then that the road to embracing new technology is a key factor in building economic growth and working our way out of the recession. In a later programme, we'll examine what is actually meant by the green economy and explore what real jobs can be generated in this industry.